For our next segment, please welcome the panel on Investing in the Energy Transition, Critical Minerals, Climate Tech, and Policy Shifts, moderated by visiting Professor of Business at NYU Abu Dhabi, John.
Good morning, everybody. Please take a seat. Welcome, and I'm glad to see we have a great turnout. This is a fantastic panel. You see the names up on the screen here, so I don't think we need to spend the time, but it's great to see all of you. For somebody who spends an enormous amount of my time in the energy sector and the energy transition, I'm sure everybody in the room would agree we're kind of racing against the clock, right? We see progress has been made, but I think the human species has a problem with midterm planning. If it's not a clear and present danger, deployment and action sometimes is not so simple. And this is a complicated window. The big or the big momentum is there in the market, but there are questions raised, of course, by Trump 2.0, with President Donald Trump reelected and coming into office. What happens to the IRA? Major ambitions set up at COP28 in the UAE consensus to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. An ambitious goal, can it be met? And then sometimes this slides off the table, but the nearly 700 million people who don't have access to clean and modern energy as part of SDG 7. A lot of progress in the last decade, but still in the 21st century to say that nearly 700 million people don't have access and 2 billion people don't have access to cooking fuels is pretty extraordinary, right? Can we give a nice round of applause to our panel here, and then we'll get underway. I wanted to raise the question to the panel, and Your Excellency, maybe you would like to start. This is a tricky window because you're involved in COP28. We want to accelerate a transition. A dominant issue around the world has been inflation. We need to provide energy to that 700 million people, and it costs a lot of money, and people are worried about the cost of it. Can we deliver all of these things to people? Can you still hit those ambitions and meet the objectives, do you think? And where does Altérra fit into that deployment?
John, first of all, thank you for letting me be here. It's really great to be part of this discussion with such an eminent panel here.
Panel, yes.
And I think we totally can. I think we have to. And you said it yourself. We have a population that is growing rapidly, particularly in the developing world. These are folks who are going to want to improve their standard of living, and we need to provide them with that better standard of living. And we hope that that's a clean standard of living in a new energy economy. We know that we need to provide about $9 trillion in investment annually to achieve our climate goals, 2.4 trillion of that roughly for the global south. So that money has to come from somewhere. We had a great outcome in Baku, 300 million that was committed for the developing world, but also a recognition that we need to bring in the private sector and other actors to provide that.
Aren't you a bit frustrated by the $300 billion amount as opposed to the ambitions that the Global South had?
I think we all would have loved for it to be more. However, I think that it's still significant and sends a signal to the Global South about what we need to do. And remember, that's committed to the Global South, and that should help to mobilize other capital. That's where things like Altérra really make a big difference, and that's what we recognized at COP28. You know, COP28 was such a great success in laying out a pathway of how we get to 1.5 or keeping global temperatures under 1.5. And Altérra was part of the solutions, the massive suite of solutions we came up with. And that's how do we mobilize capital to the Global South. That 300 billion will help for that because that's where governments will be committing capital, and then the private sector can come in behind that. So I think that these are really good outcomes, and I think that these are market opportunities. So if we are investing in a future that's clean, that is low carbon, that is a new climate economy, this is really a market opportunity.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. I'm going to circle back, obviously, with you, Your Excellency, about that. Ambassador Berger, you know, we have a title of this session, which is on critical minerals, and it looks at the critical mineral sector, climate technology policy shifts, but the energy transition. But I was wondering if we should expand the brief of it and say, is it a defense and security question at the same time? And we're looking at huge volumes here. You know, remainder of our panelists are very involved in how do we get more deployment of critical minerals, which are so important on the energy transition. But would it get everybody to wake up and move at a faster pace if we lay it out as a security issue at the forefront of it?
First of all, also good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel here today. Absolutely. It is a security question. It's a security question for us, for sure, in the European Union, but also, I'm sure you know, when we speak about COP28, we worked very closely with the UAE COP28 presidency in promoting also the climate and security nexus. We do talk about climate action from economic perspective, and I think that's what woke up the world for the first time. But now we're also talking about the security point of view when we talk about climate change. The changing climate, of course, is a risk for security. It's a risk for humanity, and this is why it is so important that we address it. But other than that, we also look at it from the different perspective when you, for example, look at energy transition, another topic of this panel. Because we have learned not so long ago that being dependent on one source of energy is very risky. And so as part of our security strategy, we also actually promote diversification of energy sources. Diversification of energy sources not only in terms of going increasingly renewable, but also geographically. This is also part of the Critical Raw Materials Act, so let me circle back to the critical raw materials, where there seems to be one major supplier of critical raw materials, whereas our policy and our, let's say, homework that we have done shows us that we have been able to build through preferential trade agreements a supply from different countries, and currently 40% of our critical raw materials in terms of value are coming from our preferential trade agreements. And following the launch of the Critical Raw Materials Act, it's the 13 countries with whom we have a memorandum of understanding on this strategic
Can you give us a quick geographical layout here?
Of course.
Next door to Africa.
Well, Africa, Namibia, for example, that was actually a great partner for us for the launch of the Critical Raw Material Acts. But we work also with partner countries like Switzerland or European countries. US is a partner on the mineral security partnership. So. And you can see security is a great part of it. So we cannot discuss energy transition or climate action without security, but we cannot also discuss it without economic growth and leaving no one behind, ESGs, and making sure that actually everyone is part of us going forward in energy transition, but also towards a sustainable future.
Good. I always said, for example, the Eastern Med has natural gas deposits, but nobody thought you needed them because you had secure supplies from Russia, right? So we learn the hard way sometimes. That's what I said, medium-term planning is sometimes difficult. Frank, can you jump in? Then I'll bring in Oskar and Bob on the security point here. How critical in your former role at the Department of State as Assistant Secretary of Energy Resources, how do you see that now for critical minerals, which I think most of society doesn't realize how much we actually need over the next 25 years? Thanks.
You got it. Yeah, well, first, thank you. I would say that the whole energy transition, it's happening. Okay, what we're talking about in terms of the policy dynamic is whether and to what extent governments are accelerating that direction. So it's not a matter of direction; it's a matter of velocity. And I think that that's an important consideration as we go forward, because as it was, you asked the question earlier about money, who's paying for what, and this is a binding constraint because our publics are going to react to costs around the kitchen table. The security dimension is absolutely going to be the framing for a lot of these questions, particularly as you mentioned at the outset, President Trump's re-election and coming back to office. Whereas the Biden administration, in terms of foreign policy, may have looked at climate change as kind of that North Star, that organizing principle, and how to engage with other states. The Trump administration will look at security as that North Star. So everything will be framed around that security dimension. And you're going to see that's going to have an impact, not just in terms of policy, but also the spending, as well as market formation and capital formation in terms of where and to invest, how to invest, and what are the new trading dynamics, trading patterns, how that's going to play out. But security is going to be kind of the calling card, I would say, going forward.
Good. Bob, you talk about market signals, and Oskar, I'd love to have you get in on this as well. So if that's the case, what Frank is saying here, what are we looking for from the United States? Because with the NAFTA agreement, President Trump renamed it. Does he scrap the IRA? Does it really matter what he does on the marketing side? And you just want to see the right signals that would help, deployment at a faster pace?
I think from a private producer, Saudi Arabian mining company, we are looking for the rate economic signals to grow. And the kingdom is in broad transition, whether you call it the energy transition or just a transition away from oil and gas dependency as part of Vision 2030. But we are deploying probably 60 billion US in the next decade or so. So we're looking for partners from the US. We're looking for markets for the products, some crazy things, but simple things like we need engineers. We got 30 or 40% of the world's cranes deployed to Saudi Arabia, so we need partners to come in and help build the place. So it's a fascinating time to be there, and whether it's defense, energy transition, food security, it all comes home.
Well, I mean, you now upgraded the assets on the ground, right? From 1.3 to 2.5 trillion dollars.
Right.
I'd love to come back to you in terms of how long that'll take to deploy. And the U.S., I think Oskar is looking at this. Saudi Arabia as a good counter option to the dominance of China in this sector. But Oskar, I'd love to have you start on this idea of the development of the sector, because it's a 10 to 20 year horizon. And I know you've given a lot of thought to how do we finance it. So are we looking at $600, $800 billion? And are we looking at the entire value chain to make sure, A, it's enticing for investors to come in? And do you pay attention to signals from the Trump administration, in this case, to have optionality here in different parts of the world? Thanks.
Sure. It's fair to say that time is not on our side.
Yeah.
If we're going to meet some of these ambitious targets for 2035 and 2050, we need to start to deploy money in size and scale almost immediately. The number of $800 billion has been touted just for copper development to meet those targets, $2.4 trillion just for critical materials, and triple that just for infrastructure related to all that. So that's quite a bit of money for anybody to deploy. And what we need to do is understand that mining takes time. You don't build a mine just because price signals ask you to build a mine. It takes 10, in some cases 15 years to build a mine. It takes 5 years to build a gigafactory. So unless you build the mines now, you're not going to have the feedstock you need for those gigafactories in 5 years' time. So it all comes down to making sure that you coordinate the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. And the upstream is the most concentrated because the mines are scale, large, to be economically viable, and they're in regions that are not typically investor-friendly or investor-easy, and those are some of the key emerging markets in Latin America and in Africa. But once those upstream assets are in place, you need to actually shift the material from there to the Middle East and into Australia to do the processing, because they have the energy pricing down correctly, and they have the land available for that midstream processing. And then obviously downstream, also in the Middle East, also in the United States, also in Japan and Korea. That's a supply chain that actually is integrated globally to provide the Western allies a balancing force to the Belt and Road Initiative that China has so successfully implemented. And unless both of those things happen, you're going to have bottlenecks, and those bottlenecks are going to dictate the pace of change and dictate the response to climate change.
Good. I wanted to raise a question. After the private session, I heard 3 or 4 people in the private session on critical minerals say, oh, I really thank the UAE and Saudi Arabia because they're thinking long term. They can make the planning, and it's a good counterbalance even to China. But does that provide enough momentum to start to rebalance? And I wanted to find out the role of environmental, social governance, right? Does it serve as a barrier for European companies, for example, to go in and invest in mining facilities? And if I can start with you, Ambassador, where does Altérra fit into this? Does it make it easier to unlock funds? What was the vision to say we can be a first mover here, we can spark activities in the global south, and then others will come off the back of it in that context of everybody sees the UAE role now as a capital of capital, but willing to map out 10, 15 years in advance?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We spent, as you know, before COP28 about a year and a half traveling around the world. I think we went everywhere and met with everybody we could to try to figure out, okay, well, where were the gaps? And we recognized that there were gaps in action, but the single thing that we kept hearing time and time again was the finance gap. And particularly the lack of flows to the global south. So not only do we have a lack of investment in the renewables in developed countries, but also particularly in developing countries because they can't get the capital for lots of different reasons. It might be political risk, it might be perceived risk, it might be currency risk. There's all sorts of barriers. And we knew we couldn't solve all of those things. And when we initially went with this idea of a solution to His Highness, we went with a much smaller pitch. But what His Highness, through his vision, understood that we need to flip the equation. Today, about 85% of investment goes to the global north when it comes to the transition, and only about 15 goes to the south, right?
It's even 1% in the least developed countries,
Exactly.
which is alarming in itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we needed to do something that would change that dynamic. And that's why Altérra is catalytic, because it's 30 billion, so we have that scale. It was much bigger than we anticipated, but our president, His Highness, launched this amazing initiative. It's 30 billion, and then we have this structure that gives us a sort of ability to act in very interesting ways. We have 25 billion that can invest anywhere in the globe, and then 5 billion that's dedicated to the global south, and then we've innovated with that 5 billion in a couple of two of the largest funds globally dedicated to the global south that we've created with Brookfield and TPG, and one that's a revival of an older fund with BlackRock, where we're using innovative methods to try to induce others to come in beside us. Because remember, our top line target is to mobilize 250 billion by 2030.
Right, and you can trigger that with these partnerships.
Yeah, and so what we've done is we've used, in the case of TPG, and we saw Jim earlier, we used what we call a FICO model, a first in, capped out model. That means that we are able to put our capital in, seed the fund. TPG then goes away and is able to raise against that. And by the way, they've done a phenomenal job, way exceeding our expectations and what all the analysts told us we would get. And then the other investors take some of the upside from that capped return. And so that gets the ball rolling. And then what we hope is that we can prove that investing in the transition makes economic sense, and that we can get that flywheel moving. And that's why Altérra is really exciting, I think, and has already disrupted the industry, because you start to see other countries replicating, other entities replicating this same model. And I think that it's been very impactful in terms of...
Good. It's a good problem that the president gave you, His Highness.
Yeah.
I think other countries would like to have the same challenge, right? Ambassador Berger, do you want to discuss the difference in policy mechanisms that we have on the table? You have the European Green Deal and you have the US IRA Act. When I talk to different executives, they say, one is the stick, which is the European Commission approach, and the other one is the carrot with incentives. Is that a fair analogy? And if you can address also this ESG issue, before the European Commission or European Union didn't want to invest in hydrocarbons, Russia deal, unfolds, or the conflict, supplies get reduced, and all of a sudden African natural gas is a really good option and you would underwrite it. How do you square the two? Security of supply for European citizens, and the ESG criteria is used when it's convenient if you don't want to get into something like this. And is the Green Deal working?
I must say that I actually disagree with you because I think
That's okay.
we are fully carrotized system in the EU.
Say that again?
Carrotized. We
are
really do
carrotized.
mostly carrots. If you look at our development cooperation, we actually provide a lot of development aid. We are the lead provider actually of official development aid globally, and a lot of it is climate finance. A lot of it is related to climate action. With increasing investments and improving environment, for example, in terms of ESGs in our partner countries, we really try to provide more finance. So that's definitely a carrot. Of course, we look at it also from the perspective of regulation, and it is important to have a regulation that allows those countries to, first of all, us to invest in our partner countries, but also then to export. For example, if it comes down to green hydrogen, if we agree that this is a green hydrogen, it's easier to export it to the EU. The tools that we use, if I use the example of the Critical Raw Materials Act, since this is one of the main topics,
Sure.
We invest in capacity building, in training, and we actually really try to accompany our partner countries to move up the supply value chain, the supply chain, which triggers additional investments. If our investors from the EU can be certain that the investment environment is stable and that it's actually good for their investments, then they will be coming more. And this goes through our partnership agreements, association agreements, also trade agreements, as a matter of fact. When it comes to hydrocarbons, I wouldn't say that we were against investing in hydrocarbons, but we were promoting quite intensively decarbonization. Of course, we are at the point of time where we do have to recognize that we cannot provide the energy that we need globally through renewable energy only. And so we are increasingly, not only because of the Russian Federation aggression against Ukraine, but also because of this reality, signing agreements, EU or member states, with partner countries. And for example, currently, more than 14% of our natural gas imports come from North Africa. So we have diversified. Of course, this was a big shock for us in 2022, but we have diversified. And it cannot be said that we are only investing in renewable energy. We are actually really investing in whatever source of energy is useful. There is a future for it. There is maybe a potential role in moving towards sustainability in the long term.
Okay, good. Thanks for taking the tougher question there. So what sort of innovation do we need then, Oskar, when it comes to financing these things? And if you're going to pick, your top 7 to 10 markets to say, where these resources are now, because governance is a huge issue. Corruption's been a challenge in Africa. How does the US, the European Union work together with other partners to say that let's unlock this, work with an Altérra to deploy money?
It's probably the most crucial question out there right now. Finance, we've talked about how much money is necessary and where it's going to come from, and do you need public support and private capital to come together? Absolutely. But the challenge is the only pure private sector member on this panel is permitting as well. So I would challenge my 4 colleagues here to say that the main reason that it takes 15 years to build a mine, but 5 years to build a gigafactory is regulatory slowdown, permitting issues, and the like. That's as big a problem as energy and as capital. And so to answer your question as rudely as I can, by asking another question, the question to my co-panelists is about permitting and what can we do about making that easier.
So you're willing. How do you see it, Bob? And then you can't speak for the Saudi government. I understand that because you're a major producer in the private sector. But they have ambitions to get into Africa. The Future Minerals Forum is actually convening 60 ministers every year, and they're looking to invest and make that a processing hub, which I think would provide some geopolitical balance as well. I'm sure Frank can address it, but how do you see what Oskar put in front of you?
I think so. The permitting and the ESG. I tell people. So, the chairman of my board is Yasser Rumayyan, the governor of the PIF, and we have we're trying to develop the mining sector as the third pillar of the Saudi economy and develop the natural resources, the gold, the copper, the nickel, the zinc, the rare earths, et cetera. We've told the board it normally takes 20 years to permit and build a mine. And they said, figure out how to do it better, faster, bring in partners, use technology, et cetera. So we've now got the largest single jurisdiction exploration program going in the world with Western partners, advanced technologies, et cetera. I took to our board that we think we can shave the cycle time from mine development, discovery to commissioning, from 20 years to 9. And Yasser said, that's unacceptable, go back and do better. So that's the ambition, the level of ambition and speed.
Is that realistic, though, is the other question?
I mean, I think it is. On paper, everything has to go right, but I mean, that's...
Yeah.
But I mean, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, it takes 180 days to get a mining license. In the US, it takes 18 years. So the government's aligned, the private sector's aligned, people are getting serious about it. Because whether it's geopolitical or not, it's good money. I mean, it makes sense to have a critical minerals processing hub right here. You've got great facilities, you've got great ports, you've got great infrastructure. So
good energy prices.
It all works, yeah.
Frank, we can pick up on a lot of things, but one of them is the elephant in the room. When I was talking about global mapping before, particularly in the environment when President Trump wants to put up to 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, having them control 85% of rare earth minerals processing and strategic metals. How do we solve that? And is that enough incentive where President Trump is actually going to support the transition from a security standpoint, as you're suggesting? Because that's vulnerability, is it not, with China?
Without question. And I guess I would just kind of go back and challenge you a little bit, John, in the sense that the focus is on what President Trump may or may not do. And I think that we have to look at what's actually occurring, not what's speculative about an administration who will occur in January 20th. And just this week, of course, China announced that they were banning the export of certain critical minerals, which are critical for modern society. So this isn't a theoretical exercise. This is actually happening. And so what do we do about it is really kind of the question. And I would say, but on this question of permitting time horizons, it's not whether we can do it, and it's not whether we can. We have in the United States, and we have a tremendous mineral endowment. It's really is there's the political will to develop it. And America traditionally doesn't, this concept of industrial policy where the federal government comes in and directs, that's really not the way things are done at scale. There's some R&D projects and where they can create some nascent technologies, but it's really the private sector, which is that execution arm. The greatest energy transformation within the modern era has occurred is the hydraulic fracturing revolution.
Yes.
And that was a matter where Congress actually directed the federal government, the federal EPA, not to regulate under federal law. And that sent the signal to the private sector, this is in 2005, to innovate and deploy capital and develop a new industry. In 2008, the shale revolution was born, and it changed the world.
Let's apply that to minerals then. What would you do if you had that same position?
Yeah, I think we have to look at, to address the permitting question in the United States context, you're going to have to offend people on the far left, and you're going to have to offend people on the far right. On the far left, of course, they don't want to touch anything, disturb any land, and you can't mine. You have to mine where the rocks are. And on the right, you're going to have to address issues like eminent domain. You're going to have to build transmission lines. You're going to have to address those key questions. And so, does an administration coming in who can't run for re-election, can they demonstrate that political will?
Oscar's smiling because we're not too sure.
Oh, come on. But we have to think about it.
Am I going to call you out on it because I think he was ready to co-moderate?
Yeah.
But go ahead. Thanks.
No. But it's a crucial question. And I guess the other point I'd like to just speak to very briefly is the question you raised with respect to ESG and the global south.
Yes.
And this is something that's remarkably underreported. Because we're creating a two-tier system where the global north benefits from all of the well-intentioned comments coming out of Brussels and other things about the energy transition, but it's an extractive model that leaves the poor poor. And I'd just like to, we were at Climate Week in New York, and there's so much talk about climate action. But around the same time that was occurring, the Department of Labor released a report that they issue every 1 year or 2 years on forced and child labor. And in that report, it says that the green energy transition is expanding, the incidence of forced and child labor is increasing, directly tied to that. So we have to think about that. And I think in terms of permitting, if we provided some exposure to what's happening in the global south and how that is not the model that we want to ascribe our lives to be, then perhaps it will create that political courage, and for both sides on the right and the left, to say we have to do better in the north.
Good. The MIMBY, not in my backyard, model has to be addressed on the public, which is another debate separately. How do we market this to people? You've been in the mining business for decades. Oskar, how do you deal, you had to deal with ESG before it was even a moniker, right? As a miner, nobody really says, I really welcome you coming in, fantastic. But if you make a difference on the community, if people see the strategic nature of it, how do you manage it at Orion? And Majid, I think it'd be interesting for you to address it. How does Altérra kind of knock down barriers where people make it as a reason to go in as opposed to stay out, if that's okay? Go ahead, Oskar.
Sure. Yes, it's fair to say that ESG issues have been around the mining space much longer than in other industries, because mining is environmentally impactful and socially impactful, particularly for the people that live around the area that's being disturbed. But at the same time, mining can be done in a much more positive way than it has been historically, and that's really on the mining industry to fix itself, and it has, by and large, done that, both voluntarily and non-voluntarily. But it's now at the point where mining is actually a better environmental steward than the perception of it. And I would say the public's understanding of how beneficial mining can be is actually lagged reality for a long time. And it's really down to a communication issue, which is why fora like this are so helpful, because we need to explain to the world that mining is not the way it was 100 years ago, and is now environmentally as helpful as it can be, and is socially acceptable, and is actually beneficial to the local population and to the country at large. And it's a way, like the oil industry was historically, it's a way to lift countries out of their history, really.
Good. We have 7.5 minutes here, so I'd love to have you pick up, Majid, on this issue of, do you have hope on the energy transition that you can make a difference, accelerating it, and then the different players that need to come to the table? Frank can address this. I think also Ambassador Berger. The lenders, do they provide some credit protection? Do they provide currency protection? What's the role of the developing bank? Where does Altérra fit into that chain? I hear the XM Bank needs to come in a big way. At the core of it, how do you make a difference, and why are you optimistic?
Yeah, if I could just real quick jump
Sure.
in on the ESG, because you sparked that thought in my mind. I think that it's been politicized a little bit, but we need to remember what it was about initially. The idea was that through this we could look at what were the risks that were associated with a business, whether they be environmental, social, or governance risks. And so that was a way of evaluating how resilient that company was, or that business was.
Or that government.
Or that government. And
Right.
so I think that we do need to try to think about how we get back to that, because it is a good tool, and maybe we just need to, it's an evolving process. And so that is something that's important. That's important to us at Altérra. Why? Because we see that we have this dual purpose. One is to be commercially successful. We want to prove that investing in climate makes commercial sense, but then having a climate impact, making sure that we're being impactful and doing that in a socially responsible way, or an environmentally responsible way. And so we have this dual purpose within everything we do. You asked me about hope. I'm very optimistic and hopeful based off of what I saw coming out of COP28, and just the enthusiasm. You were there, I think many others on this panel were there. The enthusiasm of all the participants who came and said, here are all the actions that we want to do. Now we know that we can't do, no one entity or one individual can do this by themselves. We need to work collectively, and you see that increasingly people partnering together to try to move the needle. You made a good point. We need to see governments stepping up and providing more in terms of policies, in terms of grant money or capital. We need to see reform of the international financial institutions. We know that there are barriers, particularly for developing countries, around currency, around other issues, credit ratings, perceived risks that just aren't necessarily real. And that's where Altérra really can make a difference, is that we can break down some of those barriers. And we in the UAE have been very successful at this. You know, we're of the Global South. We've been investing in the Global South for many years. Altérra is kind of a scale-up of a model that our president and Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, our chairman, have worked on over many years, where we take a little bit of financing from Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, some private sector capital. Masdar will develop a project, and you'll deliver a project in the developing world quickly and under budget, hopefully. And so those examples, what we're doing with Altérra is scaling that up, putting steroids, and going out and deploying at speed. And so I think that we can really, really move the needle, but we need others to come in and help us out. We need others to come in and invest in the funds that we've partnered with our partners on, co-invest with us in individual projects, or come in with their own ideas of concessional or grant-based or even catalytic capital like we've provided. And the more we do that with others, we recently announced that we're partnering with Rockefeller to kind of look at solutions.
Yeah, nobody really thought about that in philanthropy.
And so we're really open to working with lots of different partners to try to see how we can
major
find
change at COP28. I mean, the collection of philanthropic donors. Ambassador Berger, engagement with Africa, partnership with the US. I think the Libido corridor, for example, from Angola to the coast, a lot of those things never would have happened 10 years ago. Where do you see making a difference for the European Union in Africa, where it actually happens at pace? And we have 3 minutes left, so give me a minute, and I'm going to have the three of you chime in on the most important issue you want to walk away with here, if that's okay, please.
Well, I actually think it really is the attention that we currently have on climate finance and on the need to build renewable energy capacity in Africa. It is the global targets that were set here in Dubai at COP28. From the EU perspective, it is really increasing attention. Not that there was not enough, but we are really increasingly focused not only in capacity building and actually grants, but also investments through EIB, and we're trying to partner, for example, even with Altérra, to actually see how we can combine, overcome fragmentation. Fragmentation of finance, I think, has always been a problem.
Yeah, Oskar addressed it, though we have to look at the whole value chain.
Exactly. Right? But also, I want to come back to the division between the global north and the global south. I'm from the Czech Republic, and I was born in communist Czechoslovakia. We used to be the coal base for the Eastern Bloc, and it was, in fact, the values that we adopted, but you could also see it as being imposed on us when we wanted to transition towards being an EU member, that has helped us to diversify and to change our economy. And it actually is an example of a success story, which is now in the North, because we are counted as part of the North now. It was not always the case. And it is how we should view now European Union. I mean, we're not just Germany, France, even UK actually is not in the EU anymore. We're actually more than half of the EU members come from countries that were not the global leaders in the past.
So there's a frontier market to emerging market now attached, and growing faster than the heart of Europe, I'd say right now, Germany and France in particular, and not so indifferent in the UK where I live. Very quickly, Oskar, the three of you, please. Pick out the one that you think is the most important to address.
Yeah, absolutely. So why am I hopeful? Despite all the challenges, I guess a little bit want to pick up the story that Frank told earlier about the fracking revolution. I think technology is coming fast and hard to a historically technophobic industry, and I think technology will be the heart of building a more sustainable supply chain, and a supply chain that can actually meet the needs of COP28 and the Paris Climate Agreement.
Good.
So tech is the answer.
Interesting, but also tech with data centers right?
Absolutely.
AIs,
They're
the
a
demand
cost.
for energy is also the other side of that equation, Bob?
So while we're in Abu Dhabi sharing the weekend with the Grand Prix, and pick up on something Oskar said a minute ago, Modern is sponsoring, we're partnering with Aston Martin, but we went through the selection process. We talked to all the major teams on the grid, and one of the biggest said they didn't want to be associated with a mining company. So we looked at the car and like, what the hell? Everything on here came from a mine, but they didn't want to be associated. It's the image you were talking about.
That's the hypocrisy of the world we live in.
And then
today.
when you ask, then you say, what keeps me up at night, or what do I worry about? I don't worry about the deployment of capital. We'll figure that out. I need talent, because people don't want to join this industry.
Oh.
They don't understand that it's tech-enabled. We're not sending people in underground mines with wheelbarrows and picks and canaries. It's tech-enabled. You can do this remotely. You can do it from clean rooms. But trying to change the image of the industry to attract the talent that's going to be able to build the mines and the industries of the future.
Okay, very good. Side note, my final project for CNN was on the global energy transition. I went into a coal mine in India without security gear or a face mask, and I really was wondering if it was going to come out as they were. There's different standards in different parts of the world, right? So we need to raise those. We're out of time, so we're going to close it. But go ahead, Frank, very quickly.
So I'll finish where you started, John, which was this point about climate change, addressing climate change versus security. And I would just show that, as demonstrated from the current administration and the prior administration and the one that is ready to assume office on January 20th, regardless of the motivation, whether it's climate change or it's security, critical minerals is the mainstay. Let's not focus so much on the motivation and kind of the politicking of the thing, and let's just get after it and deploy capital and develop the economies that the world needs.
Okay. I think we should do a separate session. How do we brand this to societies where they think it's as important as you do on getting access to these? I'm going to be informal at the close here. Frank, I appreciate it. Bob, as always. Oskar, nice to meet you, Ambassador Lucie, and Ambassador Majid, CEO Majid. Thank you very much. Can you give a nice round of applause, and thanks for being so focused. Thanks.